Every single week, Hamster's Arcade Archive series gets a new release of a classic title from ages past, and more often than not, it's a shmup. So what was on tap last month? Were they cool enough to sink more time into? Were they fresh enough to do more than credit feed through? Were they worth our time, or will they end up being forgotten again? November saw a total of 3 releases in the Arcade Archive shooting space, and they definitely run the gamut in terms of visuals, sound, and complexity. Namco's Warp and Warp, Daioh's Scramble Formation, and Athena's are coming right up in this episode of Bullet Heaven. Over a decade in just a month. Wild. Daioh is a Tate-style vertical shooting game released to both Japanese and Western arcades in 1993. Unless you count its newer Warashi remake Gekyo Shooting King, Daioh would never really get a home release until the Arcade Archive's release on PlayStation 4 and Nintendo Switch on November 2nd, 2023. It's a pretty straightforward game until you look at its regional differences, so let's dive in. In a lot of ways, Daioh is similar to the typical ride-and setup we've seen in a lot of early 90s vertical arcade shooting games. It has your typical 8-way movement and a simple 2-button control scheme that handles shots and bombs. Daioh's power-up system involves P icons that increase your ship's shots through multiple levels and S icons that boost your speed. Your weapons can also be changed by picking up orbs of varying color, red for the default spreading Vulcan, yellow for missiles with low speed but high firepower, and blue for the snaking lightning attack that's super quick but deals less damage. Regardless of which is in use, the power level achieved before the switch will be maintained with the new weapon. Each of these weapons also has a unique bomber that can be deployed to not only destroy or heavily damage all enemies in their area of effect, but also clear any bullets they make contact with. As is typically the case, additional bombers can be picked up throughout the game, which can allow for more liberal use if needed. Super simple and rather pedestrian, right? Well, hold on there, partner, get a load of the Western version. The international version of Daioh takes the simple 2-button setup from the original and transforms it into a 6-buttoned monster of a control scheme. This will give you access not only to all 3 weapons at the press of a button, but also their bombers, allowing for unprecedented flexibility throughout the entire game. No guesswork needed here, you can use the best weapon for the situation at a moment's notice. While lightning can't be mixed with any other weapon, Vulcan and missiles can be fired together, allowing for a high degree of offensive power when needed. And while I'm sure this makes Daioh sound easy, well, guess again, because Daioh has an insane friggin' rank to deal with. Especially if the game is being played by stockpiling bombs and no missing stages, things are gonna get stupid fast way quicker than you might realize. Stuff like a shield item does exist, which allows for a single hit to be taken, but that's often not much of an advantage. In actuality, there's a lot about the rank system that's pretty complicated. Collecting score items, holding onto bombs, starting difficulty, and even ship movement can increase or decrease the rank by varying amounts, sometimes extremely. A rather extensive list of what adds to or subtracts rank can be found on the Daioh Shmups wiki, which I've got linked below. Not surprisingly, death is a single-hit affair and usually results in getting sent back to a checkpoint with reduced power, but mercifully, boss fights will allow for instant respawns to keep things flowing if things go south. Learning how to deal with rank is probably the best way to tackle at least the first loop, and thankfully, unlike a game such as Battle Garega, it seems that it can be managed without dying a bunch. Obviously though, Daioh will require a ton of dedication to see things through all the way to the end. But is it any fun? Well, yes, I'd say so, especially when playing the international version. Its flexibility not only makes it stand out against its contemporaries, unlike its Japanese counterpart, honestly, and figuring out how to game the system is engaging at best and interesting at worst. But that brings us to Daioh's scoring. Getting score extends to make further progress can be quite beneficial, and there's all kinds of ways to boost your score. Grabbing weapon pickups of the same type in use will boost the score by a solid 5,000 points each, as will power and speed pickups at power max. Of course, in the international version, every weapon pickup will add to the score, but this can sharply add to the rank, which is a risky proposition. The same goes with bombs. At stage end, you'll get 5,000 points for each bomb in the stock, which can get extreme. But once again, holding onto a huge stock of bombs is more or less signing your own death warrant because of the rank. Each stage also rewards the player with a fixed score, increasing with each stage cleared. The exception to this is in stage 7 of each loop, in which no bonus is awarded. Instead, a large bonus for each life in the stock will be awarded. It should also be noted that clearing each stage on the second loop is much more valuable. With regard to extends, relying on 1-up or 2-up items could be a way less risky strategy to get a couple extra chances at reaching the end of the loop, and while some manipulation does exist for early ones, Stage 5 is really the only place that a 1-up exists through a guaranteed drop. It's otherwise pretty much random. Taking all of this into consideration, the included Caravan Mode's 5-minute time limit allows you to lean hard into maximizing your score, which is much more fun. Since the rank doesn't get a chance to get super ultra mega extreme, it's totally possible to really squeeze as many points as possible out of the first 2.5-ish stages as a result. There's even separate Caravan Modes for both the original and international versions of the game, which is an excellent touch. On the presentation side of things, Daioh has decent chops in both its audio and visuals. With cool backgrounds, neat enemies, and hulking bosses, each with great design behind them, it's no wonder the carryovers from Athena would end up double-dipping under Warashi to remake this game as Shenryu later down the line. And while not as similar to Warashi's Revisit, the sound here is also great. Good effects for weapons, bombs, and explosions punctuate everything where it's needed, and the soundtrack is memorable enough to stand out among the many others I've lately been diving into from around the same time period. It's definitely miles better than Athena's own Strike Gunner, which we took a look at a few entries earlier on Bullet Heaven, so it's good to hear that such vast improvements were able to be made. From there, all of the same visual and audio options are once again present for Daioh, including Tate rotation. Daioh does a lot of things right, but it can get downright cruel with its rank unless you know how to work it to your favor. Basically, don't be a no-bomber hero. Its control is solid by default, though the international version's 6-button setup is way more fun to play, in my humble opinion. Clean visuals and good sound make for a fun audio-visual package, and its fun factor is definitely there so long as you understand that rank management is the real name of the game. Credit feeds and save state progression can help to see more of the game more quickly. Warp and Warp was developed by Namco and released to arcades in 1981. This is a super old proto-shooter that would later be released to a number of classic microcomputers like the Casio PV-1000 and MSX. It was also released to the Famicom under the likely much more familiar name Warpman. The arcade original was added to the ACA line on November 22, 2023. It's extremely basic, but shockingly shares some really interesting similarities with the later, popular, decidedly non-shooter kind of game. Let's take a closer look. There's not a whole ton to the gameplay in Warp and Warp, and that's par for the course for such an early arcade game. With its 4-way control scheme and single action button, getting the hang of things isn't going to be especially hard to do. In Warp and Warp, enemies will appear along the outer edges of all 4 sides of the screen, making their way towards the center of the playfield while shooting projectiles in an attempt to trap the player. Special enemies will also appear that will only stay on the side of the screen until they reach the end of the side they've appeared on. These will factor into scoring, which we'll talk about shortly. After a certain amount of time, a small jingle will play which indicates that your enemies have gotten faster. This makes things more challenging as the stage continues, especially as foes close into the center of the screen. It's here that a pair of barriers are found, which form a horizontal gate and serves as the staging point for each player life. These barriers will absorb all enemy shots from the top or bottom, but will allow bullets to enter from the sides. When the barrier turns from green to white, they'll display the word warp in Japanese. Making your way to and entering the gate will lead to Warp and Warp's second gameplay style, and I think you'll recognize it pretty much immediately. Warp and Warp will shift to a pure Bomberman-style game, though given the date of its release, this is the first to feature such a gameplay style, predating Hudson's much more well-recognized series by 2 years. And it's even complete with cruciform explosions and the ability to place several bombs to create a chained effect. Your foes will hunt you down in a labyrinth here, and careful placement is going to be needed so as not to blow yourself up in the process. As is typically the case, colliding with an enemy or one of their shots will result in the loss of a life, with game over occurring when all are expended. Like many other games of the era, extends can be obtained through score. Granted, getting further isn't necessarily as simple as its gameplay would suggest, with setting a high score being the primary objective of the game. But it's definitely still a pretty fun curiosity that appeals to me at least moderately on its own merits. Of course, being an ACA release, Warp and Warp's online leaderboards make it perhaps a better fit today than it used to be all the way back in 1981, with the ability to not only set high scores on the world stage, but also having those scores preserved for at least the foreseeable future. This definitely contributes to making such a basic game more appealing to me. The score attack and caravan modes do wonders for keeping my interest, where a lack of these leaderboards would otherwise make for a somewhat boring experience in very little time. And getting these scores isn't especially hard either. The basic yellow enemies will change color according to how close to the center of the playfield they are. They'll be worth the least amount of points when yellow, but the most when they're red. Special enemies are worth far more though, starting at 500 points for these little froggos here, and climbing much higher depending on others that can appear. This one was worth 2,000. Meanwhile, killing multiple enemies at a time in Bomber Guy mode will result in a tiny bonus, as special enemies don't appear in these phases. From there, getting as far as possible is all it takes to climb the leaderboards. For early games like this, I truly appreciate what having an online leaderboard brings to the table, and Warp and Warp is no exception. Warp and Warp's gameplay is decent for its time, but as with a great many other very early arcade games, its visuals and sound aren't going to turn many heads, especially today. Or are they? I mean, when I saw the thumbnail on the eShop, I definitely questioned what I was looking at. Is it a shooter, or like just an action game? Well, with that ponderance out of the way, I can say that what is here is almost as basic as it gets. Not Pong basic, obviously, but I'd say it's not even really on the level of, say, Galaxian, which Namco themselves released 2 years prior. Take the sound for example. It isn't great, with interesting choices for pretty much everything. It borders on annoying. No, I'll take that back, it is pretty annoying, but that's just kind of what early arcade games were all about, if only to differentiate themselves from one another in a sea of beeps and bloops and very little in the way of BGM. It's still not great. This is also another vertically oriented game, so Tate support is once again present. Warp and Warp's control and overall challenge could definitely have been much worse. I'd say what's here works rather well, actually, and it can go on pretty much for as long as you can. As is typically the case, the ACA leaderboards greatly enhance Warp and Warp's replayability. This is all hampered with its weak visuals and sound, but it was also 1981, so what do you want, really? It's fine for what it is. Mostly. I'm not really sure if folks will get more or less out of this one than I have, but Warp and Warp is still fun enough for me that I'm sure to go back to see if I can get further up the ranks in Caravan mode. Scramble Formation is a Tate-style vertical shooting game developed by Daioh and released to arcades in 1986. Also known as Tokyo in Western arcades, with an I, mind you, it would see its only classic contemporary home release to the MSX2 in 1987. Way later down the line, it was also included with the Daioh Egret 2 Mini and fully utilized its built-in rotatable monitor. But it felt super slippery thanks to some gnarly input delay. Scramble Formation would finally land on the Switch and PlayStation 4 as part of the Arcade Archives line on November 30th, 2023. There are some neat ideas here, but I'm not sure they're especially sound. Let's take a closer look. In a lot of ways, Scramble Formation plays like any other vertically scrolling shooting game, with your run-of-the-mill 8-way control scheme and 2-button setup for other functions like guns and stuff. However, its 1986 release is late enough that interesting features have started making their way in. Notably, destroying red enemies will leave behind drones that can be picked up and fly in formation with the main aircraft. Up to 4 at a time can fly with you, and their formations can be changed with the assigned input to enhance air-to-air fire, increase your ground attack capabilities, or simply follow in a straight line, with lowered air and ground attacks happening at the same time. While only 4 will fly with you at a time, more can be collected and added to a stock. If any are lost, they'll be replaced from this number. Right, you see, here's the thing. These drones all have their own hitboxes, so if they get hit with a bullet or an enemy, they're destroyed, leaving behind a small damaging area of effect. They can also be launched into the fray to explode on impact in the same kind of way by pressing both the fire and formation buttons. They'll be replaced with any others that are left in the stock. I mean, it sounds cool on paper, but in practice it's frustrating as hell. Enemies fire bullets from pretty much all angles, including from behind. Their spawn points will change depending where you are on the screen. They're fidgety and often hard to hit, and your drones are so fragile they're never really around for long enough to build a decent stock. Sure, some red ground enemies will bestow you with 4 at a time. Oh, how charitable, but no matter how hard I try, I can't keep them from getting picked off constantly. Worse still, enemies are displayed under power-ups, which can lead to shots coming from exactly the place I'm trying to pick them up from, with no indication that I'm about to get murked. Launching the drones is also a pain, mostly because I found that this is often done by accident. It's not really clear how many stages Scramble Formation actually has, as you're basically just flying over a bunch of in-game representations of real-world Tokyo's various districts. Each of these areas is more or less indicated with a small section where you can't fire, usually in the presence of cloud cover. Not all areas have bosses, but every now and again you'll face off against a super overpowered boss ship that makes things super hard to deal with in the absence of drones that you can huck at them. Ground attacks versus their engines will bring them down though, so long as you don't take too long. Look, I really wanted to like Scramble Formation when I played it before, but it's really no better here than the input-lagged version that I dealt with on the Eager 2 Mini. Sure, it's responsive now, that's not really the issue. It's the game design. Sharp control just doesn't help with constantly losing every extra ship I collect to a bullshit shot. It might just be me, but Scramble Formation is just not fun on its own. Thankfully, there's still the obligatory score attack and caravan modes, the latter of which, being a timed affair, holds a little more of my interest, but not much more. Taking out large amounts of ground-based enemies at a time will grant some decent bonuses depending on the number destroyed at a time. I managed a 16,000 point bonus, which, okay, cool. But like the main game itself, I found myself at the mercy of errant shots, watching helplessly as my brittle little helper shattered to dust, leaving me with nothing but my basic firepower. Easily the coolest aspect of Scramble Formation is its many depictions of real-world Tokyo in the backgrounds. While the visuals aren't particularly lush in terms of color, it's all mostly washed out. The stages are still pretty cool all told. It's just a shame that the game isn't as good. The sound is also serviceable. Its music goes hard in weird ways, and there's a little charm to it I guess, but I found it a little annoying at times. The sound effects are fine though. As is typically the case, all of the ACA accoutrement is here with Tate support once again in tow. But that's kind of all I got for this one. A rare dud. Let's get into my final thoughts. Scramble Formation's control would be fine if a third dedicated button for launching your drones as bombs was present, but it's somehow just not enough otherwise, as everything is far too fragile to reliably use. Scramble Formation has next to no staying power for me outside of the odd caravan attempt. Despite being a little washed out, its visuals are super cool, and its sound is passable, but on the whole, this is just not a very fun game. It's too frustrating in too many ways. I can't really be bothered, and that's a shame. It has great ideas hampered by dumb mechanics and too punishing a collision system. Solid pass. You know what isn't a solid pass though? The newest M2 Shot Triggers release. I spent some time with it in a recent livestream and came to terms with its myriad of range modes and nuances. With that in mind, I have a Donanpachi Daioh super feature coming, featuring all of the home releases, including the brand new M2 Shot Triggers Reincarnation release. Trigger Heart Excelica is also inbound for Switch as well, so I might revisit that with its own biggish feature, reaching all the way back to the Dreamcast. Until next time, make sure to subscribe, ring the bell, and comment below to appease the mighty algorithm. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you all again in the next one.